Welcome to I Dream of Words, where we write all the time, occasionally even using paper when we are feeling particularly old school. Let's take another short look at where a word comes from. The word is pen, a word you probably learned in the first few hours you were thinking about speaking English. It means something that writes with ink. Simple, right? In a way, yes. But where did the word come from? In thousands of years of human history, writing was a fairly late arrival compared to spoken language. We stopped being tree-bound primates, developed language, and learned how to think creatively and symbolically. Then we stopped. As often happens in the history of human innovation, the strong decided to overrule the smart. In recent history, we have seen much the same thing. It's led to the rise of democracy and the generalization of war. If you think culture is not based on the oppression of the intelligent by the stupid and the strong, think about how much more money is spent on fighting and how little on healing the sick or educating the children. How much talk is about national security and intelligence, and how little is actually, in a word, intelligent. The smart think, the dumb fight. For thousands of years, we had spoken language with rudimentary pictures for additional information. Then something changed. People started making marks in the mud, leaving that mud to bake in the sun, and creating a permanent record of their thoughts. Language was no longer transient and temporary. Written records were born one day at the river. A millennia-long journey from lines and curves to modern alphabets and ideographic writing systems had begun. Of course, pens weren't around back then. Neither was I, as old as I often get told I am by my students. They were using sticks, but as writing became more ubiquitous, it became far less useful to write if a single sentence took a block of clay the size of your torso to record, and we needed finer and finer writing instruments. In an age before metal was reliably available, especially metal that could hold a pointed edge for a long period of time without being sharpened, other things were used. In the East, brushes were created of extremely fine hairs, and languages involving strokes were born, Chinese and Japanese in particular, but much the same could be said of old written forms of Indian languages like Sanskrit and Pali, older forms of Korean, and curved stroke writing systems like Thai. The Western languages, however, took a different approach. Rather than forming a more intellectual, delicate writing system, where the writing implement's flexibility and variability was useful for communication, Western languages took the brute force approach, making all lines equal, non-directional, and thickness independent. This meant efficiency didn't depend on a finer brush or a more skillful writer, just a thinner writing implement. So it made no sense to simply use less hair to make a brush, and the sticks and reeds were far too flexible for a day of scribing. The writing medium became something loosely identifiable as ink. Very loosely by modern standards, as what we now use in pens is far closer to the Chinese version than to what was used in the West for centuries as pen writing became the accepted norm. And that meant a device was necessary to turn that pseudo-ink into letter shapes on what may have been vellum or parchment, originally made by doing what Europeans did best, killing things and using their body parts for things. Writing was also done, more like how we do it today in the physical sense, on compressed and dried plant fibers, what you can think of as the infancy of paper. Drying plants as writing surfaces was already the norm in the East, and you can find traditional paper made in the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese styles today, often called rice paper, though no rice was harmed in the making of it. The utensil of choice had to possess several useful properties. As most writing was being done by intelligent scholars, at least intelligent by Western standards of the day, these were not rich people. The rich fought wars. They didn't read or write books, so they had to be relatively cheap. They had to last a long time, as replacing them frequently would be inconvenient, and they had to be efficient. Thin, that is. If they were thick, they could certainly last a long time, but they use a lot of expensive ink and parchment, making the process unreasonably difficult to continue long term. In Western antiquity, there were few candidates. Metal was expensive and cumbersome, difficult to have in any reasonable quantity, and either far too soft to hold an edge against parchment for a long time, or too brittle to be reliable. Ceramics were too easily broken, and wood would deform quickly with the pressure and friction. The obvious answer was to use a biological solution: feathers. They were reasonably available, often dropped by birds without much attention being paid, and picked up on the street. You could cut an edge on a feather, write a little, then cut another edge, eventually running out of feather, but getting through long periods of writing without having to replace the implement. This was much like sharpening a manual pencil in modern times. The ink didn't flow through the feather, but was simply sitting in a container with the feather dipped in it. The Latin word for feather, penna, gave birth to the modern pen. Oddly enough, it came through French, as many English words do, yet French doesn't use a similar word for pen, the French word coming from the same root as the English stylus, coming from the word for stick. Oddly enough, while they start with the same few letters, Pencil comes from a totally different root word, the Latin penis, meaning tall, which many men would find a particularly stimulating and pleasant thought. So when you find yourself away from your phone and tablet, writing by hand with ink, think of those Roman scribes developing amazing new technology with the help of their avian friends. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching.